We
Yes.
do want to talk, though, about a leaked Israeli document.
Yeah, indeed. So, you know, part of what we've tried to keep the focus on here from the beginning is not only what is happening right now and the horrors of it and the details of it and the geostrategic importance of it, but, okay, what's the plan for after? And to make the 9/11 comparison again, you know, I mean, going into Iraq at all was foolish, but we also went in without a real plan for after, at least not one that made any damn sense. The Israeli government has been very insistent under Netanyahu that like, we haven't really thought about that. First, we're gonna go in and do this thing, and then we'll figure that out down the road. The U.S. has reportedly, in one of these, you know, hand-wringing dispatches, very concerned about that, trying to pressure them to come up with a plan. So we are starting to get some leaks and some details about some of the plans which are being crafted and floated in what I would describe as basically like a domestic and international kind of trial balloon. Put this up on the screen from Haaretz. The Israeli Intel Ministry suggests relocating Gazans to Sinai after the Hamas war. So completely pushing Gazans out of the Gaza Strip and into the Egyptian Sinai desert after the Hamas war. Again, this was a leaked document that gave a number of possible suggestions, but this was the one that they felt was like the best idea. They say a draft document prepared by the Israeli Intel Ministry suggests an option to initially relocate Gaza's population to tent cities in northern Sinai. This is a first indication of a possible exit strategy to the war by the political leadership. Among a number of suggestions in this new document drafted by the ministry is the possible relocation in the current war's aftermath. It suggests Israel might initially relocate them to tent cities to be followed later by the establishment of permanent communities in northern Sinai. So this is a permanent relocation, is what's being floated here. Document presents two additional alternatives. One would permit the Palestinian Authority, which has partial control of the West Bank and which was ousted from Gaza by Hamas in 2007, to control Gaza with its current residents remaining. Another option would have Israel establish local Arab rule by Gaza's residents who remain in their home offices, in their homes after the collapse of the Hamas regime. The Prime Minister's office said in response to this article, this is an initial document of the kind that can be found in dozens of iterations at all levels of the government and the security services. The issue of the day after has not been discussed at any official forum in Israel, which is now focused on eliminating Hamas's governmental and military capabilities. And Saagar, as you know, I've long thought that it was complete bullshit. That they're like, we haven't even thought about that. Because even before this war, they had thought about it. There had been position papers, there had been articulated political positions. You know, Netanyahu famously, as the head of Likud, has been totally opposed to any sort of Palestinian statehood. That's why he was interested in propping up Hamas, because he knew Hamas could not be negotiated with. There would be no appetite for peace with Hamas. He also knew that keeping the residents of the West Bank versus the Gaza Strip separated was also good for thwarting Palestinian statehood. So that's why they prefer this idea of, let's be honest, what it would amount to the textbook definition of an ethnic cleansing. They prefer that because if you allow the Palestinian Authority control over Gaza, then you have this little glimmer of a possibility at Palestinian statehood. And the reason we should take this seriously, number one, the reporting is that this was intentionally leaked to a group of basically like right-wing activists to try to get it out into the press. Again, that's why I call this as sort of like trial balloon, to see how the Israeli population responds to it, but more importantly, to see how we respond to it.
Yes.
And we also have some indications from, you'll recall, we covered Tony Blinken's discussion with President Sisi of Egypt. And one of the things that he said really stood out to me about how, you know, they put off the table like any relocation of Gazans. Let's put this up on the screen from Reuters. Egypt Sisi rejects transfer of Gazans, discusses aid with Biden. And so it was a real red flag to me that that had even been, you know, seriously discussed from the U.S. Secretary of State with the president of Egypt, and was again an indication that this whole, we don't know what we want to do thing was a bluff, and they actually had some ideas behind the scenes of what they wanted to do. They just didn't want to really come out and say it publicly.
Yeah, I think it's, I agree that it's probably a trial balloon, and it is one where I would even say the less important to us is how the Arab world will react to this. And I think it's interesting that Sisi, it seems, had some sort of inkling around this. I mean, let's also remember, Sisi has a pretty good intelligence network. It helps whenever you are a dictator of your entire country, and they're the ones who actually warned the Israelis about October 7th just a couple days before, just so you know. Clearly, he probably had some heads up that something like this was being planned. I just don't think it's honestly even feasible. They can try and trial balloon it all they want. If they were to try and forcibly relocate 1 million people or so into the Sinai, it would absolutely spark a regional war. There's no question. It also flies in the face of all U.S. policy, bipartisan U.S. policy now for multiple administrations. I believe even since the Bush administration, whenever it came to the policy of the United States government, it has been now for almost 2 decades, is we believe in a two-state Palestinian solution. This is the opposite of that. Also, it flies in the face of the previous way that we thought about Sinai, about the removal of Israeli troops, about, I think even to this day, there are still U.S. peacekeepers, at least in the region or nearby, because I know that sometimes they had a run-in with ISIS. My point being is that this is dead on arrival for the entire international community. And it is, though, I think, dangerous, especially if it's dangerous if it's came about the way that you said. It's one thing to be leaked because people are concerned about it. It's a way other thing to be leaked because they're like, no, guys, let's float this and let's see what the response is. This would set up, I believe this actually would set up a complete showdown with the Arab world. Where if this is the plan and this is what they actually want to commit themselves to, that's it, we're going to war. There's no question.
They also include in here details about the way they would sell the international community and the Arab world and the U.S. in particular on this idea. And I mean, it's unfolding. The plan lays out, some of these phases have already unfolded. So the idea is, okay, first we push them out of northern Gaza for their safety. Of course, southern Gaza also not safe, but we'll put that aside for a moment. Then we do the ground invasion. We push them out of the Strip altogether, again, for their safety. You'll remember early on with the Biden administration, there was a lot of talk of these humanitarian corridors. That was the idea of like, oh, we're going to open these humanitarian corridors so that people can flee the fighting and keep them safe with, of course, we'll let them return. And then after that, basically making the case that actually be better off for them. And, this is so destroyed now in Gaza, they can't possibly return home. So there's a whole strategy here laid out of the type of propaganda that would be used and the way it would unfold to try to effectuate this outcome. Now, I agree with you. I think the fact that Blinken made those comments publicly, that we haven't been hearing similar language about humanitarian corridors, tent cities, et cetera, from the Biden administration, I think is also another indication. But just a couple other pieces on this. So just to give you an insight into how the Netanyahu government thinks about this issue and how different it is from the U.S. typical conception of like, oh, we're in this peace process and we're working to a two-state solution, et cetera. The option of reinstating the Palestinian Authority rule in Gaza is described in this report as the least desirable because, quote, the division between the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza is one of the main obstacles today preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. So again, the reason they don't like the idea of the Palestinian Authority being in Gaza is because that would open up the possibility of a potential two-state or some sort of peace solution. So just so you have an insight into how they're thinking. And one last piece that I'll put out here, which came out maybe last week, which also shows the seriousness and the thought that's being put into this plan. Very similar plan was crafted and put out publicly by an Israeli think tank that has ties into this government. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. This is a report from this. I actually wasn't familiar with this New Lines magazine. It seems like sort of like a neoliberal was my vibe in terms of their ideology. The headline here is, as the Middle East reels, a new option takes shape. Expulsion. Years of careful diplomacy have been overturned by the current wave of violence, forcing the major powers in the region and beyond to look for new policies, however extreme. So they go on to report, put this up on the screen. Just this week, a right-wing Israeli think tank headed by the country's former national security advisor published a report on various scenarios for the future of Gaza, including a detailed plan for the expulsion of its Palestinian population to Egypt. In the paper by the Jerusalem-based Miskav Institute for Zionist Strategy and National Security, only one suggestion for a post-Hamas future is deemed viable for Israel's long-term security, the, quote, transfer of the Gaza population to Sinai or other countries. Author of the report says that Washington can play a crucial role by pressuring these countries to either contribute resources or take in displaced Palestinians themselves. Although international law says forced displacement of civilians is a war crime, the author of this report argues transferring Gazans to Sinai could be legally justified as self-defense in a time of war. So again, just shows you this is something that's being seriously considered, I think being floated as a trial balloon, both to the Arab world, to us, to the Israeli population. and is very much, part of the thought process and consideration of what the Israeli government would like to do. The last thing I'll say about that, putting aside, I know people feel a certain way when you use these terms. If you look up the definition of ethnic cleansing, this fits the definition. So put that aside. If you don't care about the morality of it, how are you going to be more secure if you just push these people out, done a complete Nakba? They're in Egypt. Like, you no longer even have your, blockade and your deep surveillance, et cetera. That's part of why I actually think that this won't fly, is because I don't know that the Israeli public, even if they don't care about the civilians and any of that, are going to feel safe under this scenario.
Look, I just think this is not going to happen. This might be their wildest dream, and if they had total power, they could, but there's just no way the international community will ever allow this to happen.
The thing is,
it's not possible.
I can't totally put it off the table just because of, these multiple reports coming out, and this clearly being floated behind the scenes, et cetera, and also because it's not like any of the potential post-war strategies makes a lot of sense. There are no good options.
I agree with you. I've said, here's what I think is going to happen. I think they're going to set up some sort of DMZ. This is why they're in the northern part of the country. That's where they're doing everything. They're going to go into Gaza City. They're basically going to level it. Then they're going to take minimal casualties as much as possible. They're going to set up some multiple kilometer demilitarized zone, which is mined to all of hell. And then they're basically going to say they dismantled Hamas, but let's be honest, it didn't actually happen. And then they're going to pull out. You take minimal casualties. You quote unquote send a message. Nothing actually fundamentally changes. Hamas will still remain quasi in power, which means that the right-wing government can always be like, see, we don't have ever serious negotiating power. The problem in all of that is the hostages, of course, and also and that's another thing where you almost want to take them at their word. When they say it's a months-long military operation, you can read it two ways. You could be like, whoa, they're really going to go into hand-to-hand combat. But the more that I see the way that they're conducting themselves, I don't see it. They're barely getting out of these tanks. You have very special forces raids. They are very, very concerned about Israeli casualties. So if you are that concerned about it, there's no scenario where you're going to be seriously engaged in what it would take to militarily accomplish this objective. The best thing you could do is just, like I said, set up some sort of DMZ. And you probably, unfortunately, because this was one of the best things that was between the two groups, they're probably just going to end the guest worker program completely and not allow Palestinians to even cross the border for anything in the future.
But that
just seems like the most likely scenario.
Think about the Israeli public. So the idea of they're going to eliminate Hamas,
it's not going to happen. It's just not possible.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? They know that. They're not fools. Right? There's no way. And there's no other government structure in place. And, there haven't been elections there in 17 years or whatever.
Yes.
It's not like there's some thriving democratic society that can put together another government. So the idea of we're going to root out Hamas, no, you're not. Okay. So how is the Israeli public going to react, even with, okay, we have this DMZ and we have these additional security procedures, et cetera, but we're going to let Hamas remain in control? I just can't imagine the Israeli public supporting that. So like I said, the reason I don't think you can rule it out is because, number one, we've already seen them executing a number of these phases. Number two, even prior to this war, this was clearly the desire of especially certain elements of Netanyahu's coalition, if not him himself, but I think also him himself based on prior support and comments. There is no good other option, and I just don't know. I don't know how it plays out. I don't know where it ends. I don't know what the Israeli public will accept, and I really want people to sit with the fact that according to this official government ministry report, they would actually rather keep Hamas there than let in the Palestinian Authority, because that would open up the possibility of peace. So they would rather have Hamas in charge than have a possibility of a Palestinian state.
Well, certainly.
I just want you to understand that's the ideology we're dealing with
Definitely,
here.
Especially the current government. And
Yeah,
the other
that's
possibility
exactly right.
is the Israeli public gets sick of war, and then they're like, look, let's actually get serious about this. If any public could do it, it would be people whose grandfathers died in the Holocaust, whose fathers had to fight in the 1967 and 1973 wars, and then whose current generation has had to live now with debilitating terror attacks. That can go two different ways. You can go one way where you want complete revenge, but if that doesn't become politically sustainable, then you turn to the other. So I would hope that we can bet on that prevailing, but of course that is not something that we can count on in the future.
Well, the last thing to say on a potentially more hopeful or moderate note or whatever is, there aren't really there aren't real leftists left in the Knesset. Like it's this whole society has shifted dramatically right, which is how Netanyahu ends up in power. But he is, and his coalition is the most extreme in history, and he's hanging on to power by his fingernails. So it's not even close to clear that he and his government would be the ones coming up with and implementing whatever the strategy is for the day after.
Yes, exactly right.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.